Hi, this is part 7, comparing partial preterism with full preterism, and I'm Mike Blume. Thank you for watching this video. In part 7, we've been discussing the difference between partial preterism and full preterism, and showing how that partial preterists, such as myself, believe in a future rapture of the church or resurrection, a physical resurrection, whereas full preterists believe that when you die, that is when your resurrection occurs, and you leave your body with a physical, or rather a spiritual body that's invisible and non-physical. We're showing that that is incorrect according to the context of 1 Corinthians 15. Paul said that we have no hope if Christ was not resurrected or raised. Why? Because our hope is the resurrection. So this is telling us that the resurrection of Jesus is our hope. But full preterists say that the changing of our bodies will not occur as the resurrection of Jesus Christ occurred. They say that our changed bodies will be like Jesus' ascended body which he received in the clouds. Now this is some full preterists. Other full preterists say, oh no, the body with which he came out of the grave is a spiritual body, but it's not physical, so he only did that for their sake so they could see him. But no one's going to see us and our bodies when we resurrect. That's error. Anyhow, they say that our changed bodies will be as his spiritual, non-physical body, so to speak. But Paul does not base our resurrection on any body that he received in the clouds, for one thing. He bases it upon the part of Jesus' experience where Jesus was raised out of the grave and seen by so many people. That is the link to our resurrection. That is the manner in which our resurrections will be. 1 Corinthians 15:23 says, but every man in his own order. Christ the first fruits, afterward they that are Christ's at his coming. Now notice that it's a time issue when it uses the term first fruits. One person told me as a full preterist that they said first fruits isn't an issue of time so much as it's an issue of a showcase. Jesus was showcased and so he had to be visible. But we're not going to be showcased because we're not first fruits, so we're going to be invisible. And they say that from the law of first fruits, they would take the first harvest, sacrifice it to God in a big showcase, and the rest of the harvest was gathered later. And so he used that to say that's the only reason Jesus was seen, because he was being showcased as a first fruits. That is not the element of first fruits that we're supposed to consider. The element is an element of time only. Everything else is identical. By the way, the first fruits harvest wasn't any less physical than the rest of the harvest, or the rest of the harvest wasn't any less physical than the first fruits. They were both identical in all ways. It's just that one was gathered first and the others weren't. That's why it says afterward, when it says Christ the first fruits, afterward they that are Christ at his coming. It's only an issue of time, not physical versus invisible or non-physical. If it was an issue of physical versus non-physical, it would have said Christ the physical first fruits. Afterward, they that are Christ with an invisible resurrection at his coming. But nothing is said about physical or invisible or non-physical or whatever. It's only time. And based upon comparing Christ's resurrection from the tomb to be seen of all, we then read verse 23. We just read, since he's the first fruits, there will be others to follow. First always implies there are more to come, just like a first resurrection. You know there's going to be a second, or else the word first wouldn't even been mentioned. What part of his experience is called first fruits? What part of his experience are we to experience to follow? You'll find the answer if you read verses 1 through to 8 of 1 Corinthians 15. That's simple as that. The experience of Jesus that occurred first, which we will also experience, is the resurrected body from the tomb. Getting that resurrected body. That is the pattern for our resurrection. That's the plain context here. Not any ascension into the clouds where some full preterists claim he was changed. That's not the pattern at all. Based upon all of that, Paul then says in verse 35, but some will say, how are the dead raised up? And with what body do they come? Thou fool, that which thou sowest is not quickened except it die. He asks us what body does the dead have when they are raised. And he says they will have a body with which they will come up at that raising. The answer is to find the answer to the question of when Christ was raised up. And we know he was raised on the third day. Now watch this. He wasn't raised the 43rd day. The body we're going to have is the one with which he was raised on the third day. 3 days after he was buried, he came out of the tomb. And then 40 days after that, adding to 43, he went into the clouds. And that's when some full preterists say his change occurred, and that's the body we're going to get. No, it doesn't say the 43rd, it's the third day. And so verse 35 says that the spiritual bodies we will have are like the body Jesus had when he was raised up, when he was resurrected, not when he ascended. And that speaks of the body in which he was seen, as Paul speaks about from verses 1 to 8 of the same chapter. You've got to chop off all the verses before verse 35 in 1 Corinthians 15 and throw them away, and forget the note about what was raised in verse 35 in order to say that the bodies which we will have will not be like the body with which Jesus Christ was raised from the tomb. But verse 35 says that the body with which Jesus was raised is the body we're going to have. Let me read that again. But some men will say, how are the dead raised up? And with what body do they come? These verses say that the bodies of those who are presently dead shall remain in a grave until the trumpet sounds in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 51 to 52. 1 Thessalonians 4, verses 16 to 17 say the same thing. Paul taught that the terrestrial body is changed into the spiritual body. Verse 40 is not talking about our bodies. When it says celestial, it's speaking of what we read in the next verse, 41. Let's read verse 40 and 41. There are also celestial bodies and bodies terrestrial. But the glory of the celestial is one, and the glory of the terrestrial is another. There is one glory of the sun, and another glory of the moon, and another glory of the stars. For one star differeth from another star in glory. So verse 41, speaking of the sun, moon, and stars, are the celestial bodies that verse 40 is talking about. It's not saying we're going to have a celestial body. It's just saying that there's a change, there's a difference in glories, and there's a difference from the earthly body and the spiritual body, just as there is from terrestrial bodies and celestial bodies. Paul didn't say our new bodies will be celestial. He's simply differentiating the various bodies in the universe, earthly or terrestrial, and non-earthly celestial. Just as he differentiated between the body of the seed and a body of a plant that comes from the seed. The point he was making about the body of a plant and seed is that the body of the seed is changed or transformed into the body of the plant. It's the change and transformation point we're supposed to notice. Now, that isn't present in full preterism. Jesus wasn't raised up in a terrestrial body. His body was changed in the resurrection into a spiritual one, just like a seed is changed into a stalk. Furthermore, Jesus was never said to have an earthly body when he came out of the grave anyway, like some full preterists say. They're contending that Jesus' resurrected body was earthly because it was an earthly body that was buried, and the same body came out. And since the Bible says earthly bodies can't enter the kingdom of heaven, then the earthly body he resurrected with cannot be what Paul is saying. The spiritual body we shall all have is what Jesus had at that time. But they're actually mixing up the entire thought of Paul. They're ruining his context. He never said anything about an earthly body of Jesus coming out of the grave. When he was talking about an earthly element, he was not speaking about the body. 1 Corinthians 15 and 47. The first man is of the earth, earthy. The second man is the Lord from heaven. Adam himself was earthy, not just his body. Jesus is not earthy, nor ever was earthy. This is not talking about Jesus' body when it says earthy. Why do full preterists speak of an earthy body of Jesus when earthy is not referred to anybody's body at all? Earthy is only used in this entire chapter to refer to the origins of Adam, as opposed to the origin of Jesus Christ. Adam was from the earth. Jesus was from heaven. Jesus was heavenly. Keep watching Part 8.